Okay, we're still engaged in our journey up to the cerebrum, and so we're going to talk about chapter 24 and chapter 25, talk about the support systems of the cerebral cortex. So we need a good blood supply, which we'll talk about in chapter 25, and the cerebrospinal fluid system, which we'll talk about in this chapter. And they are all supporting the cerebral cortex and the nervous system. So we'll also talk about disorders of the fluid system and of the circulatory system. So for the learning objectives, I want you to be able to list the primary functions of cerebrospinal fluid and briefly describe the flow of CSF. Be able to list the pathology, signs, and symptoms of several different disorders. Some of these are CSF and some of them are brain circulation disorders. So I've combined the two chapters in the module, and there are charts of the pathology and signs and symptoms of all these different pathologies, all boiled down into a little nutshell for you to study. The cerebrospinal fluid system regulates the extracellular milieu and protects the central nervous system. So a lot of the chemicals in water and amino acids that have to be there for the brain cells are carried by the cerebrospinal fluid system, and it also provides cushioning and force absorption. It's the CSF itself is formed primarily in the ventricles. It circulates through the ventricles and into the subarachnoid space before then being absorbed into the venous circulation. So the ventricles, conveniently enough, are numbered so you know where they go to and from. The CSF supplies water and certain amino acids and specific ions to the extracellular fluid, and it probably removes metabolites from the brain as well as the glia and their cleanup function. So the CSF is all integral to that as well. The ventricles are CSF filled spaces inside the brain, and it's the system of 4 ventricles, and because we have those fluid-filled ventricles inside the brain, that is part of the cushioning effect. So the lateral ventricles are paired on either side. In this diagram, it's the like a coronal slice, and so the lateral ventricles are sort of the big hook-shaped parts on the top. There are 2 of them. There's one in each cerebral hemisphere. So they consist of a body, what they call the atrium, and anterior, posterior, and inferior horns. Do you need to know the details about the ventricles? You do not. But just giving you an idea of what the 4th ventricles are, the biggest ones, and there are 2 of them. I don't really have a slide for the other ventricles, but the 3rd ventricle, you see there's the interventricular foramen from the 4th ventricle. It's a tiny little passage that goes to the 3rd ventricle, which is right in the middle of the brain. And then there is a little passage, the cerebral aqueduct, and remember that went through the midbrain when we looked at that cross-section of the midbrain, going to the 4th ventricle. So the lateral ventricles, if you want to number them, the lateral ventricles are 1 and 2. The 3rd ventricle is near the thalamus. The cerebral aqueduct goes between the 3rd and the 4th, and the 4th ventricle is in the brainstem pretty much. And so that's basically the flow. And then it goes from the 4th ventricle into the subarachnoid space, where it is then absorbed into the venous system. The meninges, they're the 3 layers of the brain covering the spinal cord. The dura mater surrounds the brain and consists of that outer layer firmly bound to the inside of the skull, and an inner layer. The arachnoid is a delicate membrane loosely attached to the dura, and the pia mater is tightly opposed to the surfaces of the brain and spinal cord. So you can see in this picture, it shows the fluid underneath the arachnoid, in between the dura and the arachnoid, and there's a lot of reabsorption of the fluid going on there. So the meninges can be damaged, obviously, from trauma, and when you have blood or fluid building up between the layers, that can cause a problem, and we'll talk about some different disorders related to that. So some of the cerebrospinal fluid is formed by extracellular fluid leaking into the ventricles, but most of it is secreted by the choroid plexes in the ventricles. So the fluid is formed from blood by filtration, active transport, and facilitated transport of certain substances. So the CSF needs to have a certain chemical composition, and these active transport and facilitated transport and blood filtration accomplish that chemical makeup that you need. So you can see this is like a different look of the CSF system, and you can see how it surrounds and cushions the brain. It also has arrows showing the general flow. So the little sort of wing-shaped thing at the top is the two lateral ventricles going into the third ventricle, the fourth ventricle, and then into the subarachnoid space. So common disorders of the cerebrospinal fluid system are hematomas, which are usually a consequence of trauma, epidural and subdural. So epidural meaning above the dura and subdural meaning below the dura. That depends on where the blood is building up. Hydrocephalus, which is basically water on the brain, but it's a blockage usually of fluid, and so it builds up in certain areas. And meningitis, which is inflammation caused by bacterial or viral infections, which affect the meninges. Hydrocephalus occurs if CSF circulation is blocked and the pressure builds in the ventricles. Common causes include failure of the fourth ventricle foramina to open. So a lot of times that's a developmental hydrocephalus. Blockage of the cerebral aqueduct in the midbrain. There is a particular type of cyst that's called a Dandy-Walker cyst that causes hydrocephalus, and Arnold-Chiari malformation because the brainstem is projecting down through the foramen magnum and you get compression. And hydrocephalus is usually categorized as communicating or non-communicating, and that depends on whether it's a complete blockage, is non-communicating, no fluid's getting through, and communicating a little bit of fluid is getting through. So in an infant or a young child who has sort of the developmental type of hydrocephalus, they tend to have a disproportionately large head size because of the excess fluid, a large anterior fontanelle, poor feeding, inactivity, and a downward gaze of the eyes. You can have hydrocephalus in adults, and it's usually caused by trauma or some type of disease. There is such a thing as normal pressure hydrocephalus, where there isn't a buildup, but there is still some compression on the brain structures, and you get dysfunction resulting from that. So usually the treatment for hydrocephalus is they put in a shunt that is shunting the fluid out of the blocked ventricles into the rest of the body, back into the venous system, basically. So common causes of congenital hydrocephalus are failure of the fourth ventricle foramen to open, blockage of the central aqueduct, cysts in the fourth ventricle, or Arnold-Chiari malformation. This is a diagram of a shunt, so it's shunting from the lateral ventricle back down into the venous system. So meningitis is where the membranes of the cerebrospinal system are affected by either a bacteria or a virus. So just like pneumonia, it can be caused by bacteria or virus. Meningitis can also be caused by bacteria or virus, and both of them can kill you. So inflammation of the membranes that surround the brain or spinal cord. The signs and symptoms are headache, fever, confusion, vomiting, and neck stiffness. So there is a vaccine for a couple of the common types of meningitis, as well as for pneumonia, just FYI. But it's definitely a serious problem.